We all want to stay young forever, but Elizabeth Báthory took it to a level of pure evil. They say she bathed in the blood of hundreds of virgins to keep her skin glowing. But was it magic or just madness? Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the skin on your face, the warmth, the subtle tension as you touch it. It is fleeting and you know it. Time whispers there. Mirrors are not kind, they do not lie, yet they are cruel. In the soft reflection you may already notice it. The smallest lines, the faint shadows under eyes that once held only light. It is universal. We all fear it, the slow, inevitable erosion of our youth. Imagine a woman born into opulence whose every mirror reflects her power. Her hands are delicate, her eyes sharp, her hair a crown of dark silk. But even silk fades, even crowns lose their luster. Elizabeth looked at herself as all of us do, and felt the tick of time like a drum in her chest. Each day brought a new tremor, a new reminder that beauty is finite, that power is tied to appearances, and that mortality is patient, persistent, unyielding. Perhaps you are listening in a quiet room, late at night. Maybe the world outside hums with life, indifferent to your fears. Or perhaps it is dawn and light spills across your skin like a slow truth. Wherever you are, consider this. What would someone do if beauty was power? If youth was not a privilege but a weapon, one that could be used, hoarded, protected at any cost? We tell ourselves legends to make sense of fear. The stories of Elizabeth's blood baths are brutal, yes, but they are also symbolic. They are mirrors of our obsession. They are reflections of a mind that understood, perhaps too well, that the world rewards the beautiful, punishes the aged, and whispers in the hallways of power, "Stay young or vanish." She walked through candlelit corridors, her gowns rustling like soft warnings, her footsteps measured. The servants knew, a glance too long, a word misplaced, and fear might touch them cold as iron. But the real terror was more intimate. It was in the looking glass. It was in the question that haunted her and haunts all of us. What will become of me when the mirror no longer smiles back? Time is patient, but she was impatient. And in that impatience a story began. Not one of random cruelty, but of a mind pushed to extremes by the simplest, most human desire, to be seen, to remain, to shine. As you drift, listen. Let your awareness brush against hers. Let the corridors of her mind wind through yours. Hear the subtle, insistent question echoing in the quiet. What lengths would you go to if the loss of beauty meant the loss of everything? And so the legend begins, not with blood but with fear. The fear we all share, that quiet ticking clock beneath the skin, reminding us that nothing lasts forever. Elizabeth's story is a mirror, and when you look into it you may see more than history. You may see yourself. What would someone do if beauty was power? Youth is a currency, though we rarely admit it. In Elizabeth's world it was everything. Beauty opened doors, commanded respect, commanded desire. And every day, as she looked in mirrors polished to perfection, she measured not just her reflection, but her influence. The glow of her skin, the sharpness of her gaze, the tilt of her head, all signals that she could command attention, demand obedience, and negotiate power without words. The noble court is a jungle of appearances. Every gesture counts, every laugh observed, every misstep remembered. In such a place, aging is the first betrayal. A wrinkle is more than a line. It is a crack in armor, a whisper that authority is fading. To fade is to disappear, and Elizabeth could not allow herself to vanish. She walked past her peers, women who had once rivaled her for status, now fading, diminished by time, their voices quieter, their laughter brittle. She noticed the subtle envy, the silent calculation. She understood the truth her mother had hinted at when Elizabeth was still a girl. In a world ruled by men and appearances, A fading beauty is nearly powerless. The strongest women, she realized, wielded youth as deftly as any sword, and yet the sword is finite. The mirror is relentless. Elizabeth's obsession was not vanity alone, it was strategy. Each day she performed rituals of care, examining her skin with a scientist's precision. Oils, potions, baths, massages. She catalogued what made her glow, what dulled her brilliance, what could be controlled and what could not. And still she feared. Still she looked for more, because beauty is fleeting and fear of fading is infinite. Imagine the castle corridors lined with portraits, images frozen in perfect youth. Elizabeth walked among them like a queen among ghosts, each painting a reminder of what she might lose. She studied the faces, tracing the smiles, the smooth skin, the sparkling eyes. These were not just reminders of her mortality, they were lessons in power. If she could preserve what others inevitably lost, she could maintain dominance. But the fear gnawed, subtle and insistent. Aging is not dramatic, it is gradual, like water wearing stone. It seeps into bones, softens flesh, steals the immediate, the striking. And for someone like Elizabeth, who understood the currency of looks, each new line, each shadow, each hint of sagging was a loss of authority, a diminishing of her leverage in a world already poised to dismiss her. Power and appearance intertwined so closely that the threat of decay became unbearable. She knew that no skill, no intellect, no charm could fully compensate for a world that revered youth, and so obsession took root. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, her own survival, her own relevance, her own survival in the hallways of nobles who measured worth by reflection. She began to notice patterns. Servants whispered of remedies, alchemists offered elixirs, and Elizabeth, brilliant, curious, willing, absorbed it all. Knowledge became another form of beauty, control over one's flesh, over perception, over the illusion of permanence. The more she learned, the more she realized. To lose beauty is to lose power, and losing power is unthinkable. Even now, centuries later, we can sense the truth behind the legend. It is not the blood itself that terrifies, it is the relentless desire, the precise fear, the intimate obsession with the inevitability of decay. Because in every mirror we pass we glimpse it. In every photograph, every glance, every fleeting reflection, the same whisper returns. Youth fades, beauty fades, influence fades. And what lengths will we go to, silently, to hold it? Elizabeth went further than most. The ways she sought to cheat time, to seize youth, are extreme, but they are extensions of something we all feel, quietly in the dark. The desire to remain, to matter, to be seen as we once were. And so the story bends from reflection into action, from fear to obsession, from thought to deed. Elizabeth was not born cruel. She was born into a world that required a hardness she could not escape. Imagine a girl walking down the stone halls of a sprawling castle, the scent of firewood and polished wood mingling with faint, persistent undertones of fear. Every corner echoes with authority, every shadow watches. Here punishment was not just a consequence, it was a spectacle. Pain was art, pain was order. Pain was expected. From her earliest years she observed the patterns. A servant missteps and the nobles around her lean forward with quiet anticipation, absorbing the performance. Voices rise in reprimand, but the real message is silent. Control must be visible, and cruelty has a rhythm. Children are taught early that the world does not protect the weak. Survival depends on understanding, participating, even embracing, the subtle cruelty of others. Elizabeth's childhood was punctuated by lessons in authority, in hierarchy, in the unspoken rules of power. She watched her parents enforce obedience with precision. A broken teacup was not a minor inconvenience, It was a demonstration. A glance, a raised hand, a sharp word, each moment carved into memory, each act a note in the symphony of control. Emotional detachment was not optional, it was necessary. It was a castle of mirrors, both literal and metaphorical. Every act of cruelty was observed, catalogued, internalized. She learned that the smallest gestures could wield enormous influence. She saw fear become an instrument, wielded not for vengeance but for compliance. And she noticed something subtle, dangerous. The line between observation and participation is thin. Children absorb what they see. They learn the taste of fear, the texture of control, the rhythm of silence. Even the toys were instruments of conditioning. Dolls dressed immaculately, always upright, always perfect. Games of strategy where losing meant humiliation, where mistakes were remembered. Play itself was a rehearsal for power, for dominance. In this environment, compassion could feel like weakness. Affection was conditional. Attachment was negotiable. And curiosity, Elizabeth's sharp, unrelenting curiosity, was shaped against the backdrop of these lessons. But cruelty was not always public. Sometimes it arrived in whispers, in the closed rooms where servants spoke in muted tones and doors were tightly shut. She learned quickly that silence could protect, that the absence of protest did not indicate approval, and that memory could be pliable under pressure. Pain, she realized, could be both physical and psychological, and the latter often lasted far longer. Imagine her, a child alone in a dimly lit chamber, listening to footsteps echo along the stone. Each footfall carried authority, each creak of a door held meaning. She understood the language of the castle, the rhythm of expectation, and the weight of observation. It was not enough to act correctly. One had to anticipate, to perform preemptively, to internalize the rules before they were spoken. This environment shaped her mind, sharpened her instincts, and honed her detachment. Violence became a lens through which she viewed the world, not as horror but as a tool. It was a logic, simple and precise. Those who understood fear could wield it. Those who ignored it would be consumed by it. Elizabeth did not question the morality of her upbringing. Morality was abstract, inconvenient. She learned instead to map the landscape of control, to predict reactions, to measure the smallest tremors in the faces of others. In the quiet spaces between punishment and obedience, she began to see patterns. Cause and effect were tangible. Pain could be directed, fear could be shaped, loyalty could be manufactured. By the time she was a teenager, cruelty had become normalized, almost natural. She understood it intellectually and emotionally. She could watch suffering without immediate discomfort, and she could calculate the ripple effects of a single act. It was a survival skill, honed in the cold light of the castle, but it also became the seed of something darker, a fascination with mastery, with the manipulation of life itself, with the ways the human body and mind could be influenced, guided, controlled. In these early years, Elizabeth was learning to see herself not as a girl, but as an observer, a strategist, a mind in constant motion. And in the quiet recesses of that observation, a dangerous idea took root. Control is power, and fear is its instrument. Later, this would extend beyond strategy into obsession, and obsession into legend. The castle was her classroom, cruelty was her curriculum. And the child who once trembled at the small injustices of daily life would grow into a woman who understood that the ultimate lesson was in mastering both fear and desire, her own, and that of everyone around her. By the time she could reflect, even in part, the castle had already shaped her world. Her mind, trained to see patterns, to anticipate, to detach, would now turn inward. And the obsession that began with survival would soon twist into something far more intimate, far more dangerous, a hunger for permanence in a world defined by decay. Elizabeth was not merely a product of her environment. She was a mind, sharp, insatiable, a child who learned early that knowledge could bend the world, or at least her perception of it. While others her age played with dolls and whispered secrets in sunlit gardens, she was absorbing lessons in anatomy, medicine, and human behavior, seeing patterns where most saw only chaos. The castle's libraries, though small by modern standards, were labyrinths to her. Shelves groaned under manuscripts written in fading ink, texts on herbs, remedies, the workings of the body, and the subtle mechanics of power. She devoured them. She questioned everything. She practiced experimentally and quietly on observations on herself, on willing, sometimes unsuspecting, servants who brought news, tea, or silence. Imagine her sitting in candlelight, quill in hand, tracing diagrams of bones, veins, muscles, each line a quiet step toward understanding the fragility of life, the impermanence of flesh. She learned how skin healed, how the pulse faltered, how the heart could be persuaded to race or slow. Knowledge became a lens through which she could see and control what others only felt or feared. Education in Elizabeth's world was more than schooling. It was a form of power. To understand the body was to grasp the essence of human limitation and human desire. She studied remedies not for healing alone but for preservation. How could youth be prolonged? How could vitality be captured, transferred, or mimicked? Each recipe she copied, each herb she weighed, each subtle observation of a servant's pallor or blush became data. Patterns emerged, possibilities appeared. And with them came obsession. Her intelligence was both a shield and a scalpel. It allowed her to navigate court politics with precision, to manipulate social dynamics, to predict outcomes with chilling accuracy. But it also sharpened her fears. Knowledge revealed the limits of her body, the inevitability of decay. The more she learned, the more acute her awareness of mortality became. And mortality, she realized, could be resisted, but only if one dared to reach beyond conventional morality. She experimented in quiet ways, small at first. Oils mixed with powders, baths with extracts, compresses and ointments. Every act was calculated, deliberate. She observed the effects on skin, on eyes, on posture, on energy. She catalogued successes and failures like a scientist of beauty, a scholar of youth. Yet even as she recorded, she dreamed, not just of health, but of defying the slow tick of time. The knowledge that allowed her to preserve also illuminated what could never be preserved. Every line she traced in her notebooks, every formula she wrote, was both a map and a mirror. Her curiosity was relentless. She studied anatomy not for cruelty, not yet, but for comprehension. She wanted to know the body as a painter knows canvas, as a musician knows keys, as a strategist knows terrain. Flesh became language, blood became rhythm, and each observation a note in an internal symphony of power. The young girl who had once watched punishments with quiet detachment now imagined control over life itself, subtle, precise, inevitable. Isolation within the castle amplified her obsession. Teachers, tutors, and guides were limited, peers were transient. The mind, left alone, wandered, and Elizabeth's mind wandered toward permanence. She began to imagine the impossible, ways in which life could be captured, essence could be stored, vitality could be borrowed. Her intellect fed her obsession, giving it structure, method, and clarity. What began as curiosity became strategy, and strategy became compulsion. She read about myths, about legends of immortality, about rituals whispered in hidden corners of Europe. Not all were credible, but all were instructive. They revealed desires unspoken, possibilities untested. Some might have dismissed them as superstition. She saw them as hypotheses waiting to be explored. In her world, curiosity demanded experimentation. Knowledge was never enough without action, and action without understanding was folly. Elizabeth's intelligence was a double-edged sword. It provided the tools to extend life, to manipulate perception, to outwit rivals. But it also illuminated limits she could not accept. Time remained unyielding. Age remained persistent. Mortality was patient. And she, brilliant as she was, found patience unbearable. Knowledge without control became torment. By her early 20s, her mind had sharpened into something both extraordinary and dangerous. An intellect capable of seeing the human body as a canvas, human behavior as a system, and human mortality as a puzzle to be solved or circumvented. She understood anatomy, but more importantly, she understood desire, fear, and the fragility of human perception. And in that understanding, a thought began to crystallize. If knowledge could preserve, if intelligence could manipulate, then perhaps the essence of youth could be acquired, held, and wielded. It was the turning point. A moment where thought and obsession intersected, where curiosity became compulsion, and where intelligence laid the groundwork for legend. And though the castle walls remained silent witnesses, the corridors carried the whispers of a mind growing restless, patient, and intent on defying what the world considered inevitable. Knowledge had given her a gift, but it had also awakened a hunger for control, a hunger for permanence, a hunger that would, in time, take form not just in study, but in action, in ritual, in obsession. The legend, in other words, had not yet begun, but the mind that would sustain it had been forged. Imagine a castle perched on a hill, stone walls rising like silent sentinels against the sky. The wind whistles through its battlements, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and distant forests. Inside, corridors stretch like veins, hollow and echoing. Each footstep rebounds, lonely and precise, as though the stones themselves remember every secret, every whisper, every shadow. This was Elizabeth's world, vast yet suffocating, magnificent yet imprisoning. Her husband, a figure of nobility and absence, was often away. His letters arrived infrequently, formal and distant. The responsibility of the castle, its finances, its reputation, fell increasingly on her shoulders. She had power, yes, but it was a lonely dominion. A ruler in her own right, yet confined, always observed, always anticipating. The walls she had known since childhood, familiar and protective, now became a crucible. Isolation sharpened everything, desire, fear, obsession. In the quiet of the castle, mirrors became her companions, but they were not mere reflections, they were interrogators. They reminded her of time, of decay, of the relentless erosion of youth. Without peers her own age, without the daily interruptions of the outside world, her mind could wander freely, dangerously. She studied herself not only to preserve her beauty but to understand it, to measure it against an invisible standard that only she could see. Each day the question lingered, how much longer before the mirror betrayed her? Servants passed through, shadows in flowing gowns, eyes averted. They brought reports, meals, and the muted hum of human life, but their presence was fleeting. Conversation was measured, polite, often silent. There was no challenge here, no debate, no reflection of her internal turmoil. The castle was both kingdom and cage, a place where the outside world existed only in fragments, a letter, a visitor, a fleeting rumour. And in that vacuum, imagination flourished, unrestrained, unchecked. Alone, Elizabeth's thoughts spiralled with precision. She would trace patterns in her mind, the passage of time through her skin, the slow flattening of her cheeks, the subtle dimming of her eyes. She measured her reflection against memory, against portraits, against the whispers of what beauty had meant yesterday, what it promised tomorrow. And when the reflection faltered, even slightly, the castle seemed to close in. Walls grew higher, corridors narrower, shadows longer. In solitude, obsession deepened. The human mind, when left without correction or interruption, tends toward extremes, and Elizabeth was no exception. Her intelligence, her curiosity, her fear of decay, all combined into a quiet, relentless pursuit, the preservation of youth, of vitality, of herself. The castle, silent and expansive, became a laboratory of thought and reflection. She experimented in private, recorded observations, refined formulas, and allowed her imagination to wander into possibilities that the outside world might call unnatural or impossible. Loneliness sharpened her perception. Every sound became meaningful: the creak of floorboards, the rustle of a curtain, the distant howl of wolves. Each was a note in the symphony of her isolation, and with it came an acute awareness of control. She could shape her environment, command the servants, direct the flow of attention, yet she could not command time. That remained stubborn, unyielding, untouchable. And in that tension, her obsession found both fuel and focus. Isolation also distorted the boundaries between desire and necessity. Without the feedback of peers or the reality of a bustling social world, the line between what she feared and what she sought blurred. The pursuit of youth, once abstract, became tangible, almost actionable. Her solitude allowed her to rationalize, to plan, to imagine the unthinkable, that the vitality she craved could be harvested, extracted, possessed. The castle's rooms, once spaces of comfort, became arenas for the mind. Candlelight flickered across her reflection, shadows tracing the contours of her face as though highlighting the subtle betrayals of age. In the quiet, these betrayals screamed. The isolation did not merely intensify her fear, it shaped it into method, into strategy, into obsession. Elizabeth's world was vast, yet narrow. Power was hers, yet incomplete. Knowledge was abundant, yet insufficient. Mirrors reminded her of the limits of mastery, and silence amplified the urgency. The absence of others' eyes allowed her to see herself in ways both intimate and unsettling. And within these walls, a slow transformation began. Fear crystallized into desire, observation into action, imagination into the blueprint of legend. The castle, grand and echoing, became both protector and jailer. It held her physically, but more importantly, it held her mind, creating the conditions for obsession to flourish. And as night fell, as candles flickered and shadows stretched, Elizabeth sat alone, listening to her own heartbeat, feeling the pulse of the castle and understanding something terrifying. Control without balance is dangerous. Isolation without correction can warp even the sharpest mind. And she, brilliant and beautiful, was poised at the edge. In that solitude, the first seeds of action took root. The obsession that had grown in quiet observation, in relentless curiosity, and in fear of decay began to shift. It would soon move outward. The corridors, once empty, would not remain silent forever, and the hunger to preserve what time threatened to steal would find its first human instruments, those who were young, vulnerable, and fleeting. The castle had shaped her, sharpened her, and in its echoing halls it whispered the possibility of immortality, or something terrifyingly close. The first time she noticed the new girls, Elizabeth did not see faces. She saw potential. She saw vitality distilled into fragile, pliant forms. Their laughter, light and unguarded, echoed through the castle corridors like a reminder of what she had already lost, or feared losing. Skin unmarked by time, eyes bright with curiosity, hair like threads of sunlight. They were walking mirrors of the past she could never reclaim. Imagine observing youth as a currency, as a resource, as a force you could measure, weigh, and, in theory, acquire. It was no longer an abstract fear, it had become tangible. Each young servant that arrived at the castle was not merely a girl learning a task. She was an equation, a variable in a problem Elizabeth was determined to solve. How could the vitality of youth be captured? How could it be held? How could it be transferred? The castle, silent and echoing, became a theatre for her mind. Candles flickered against tapestries as she observed their gestures, the way they bent to polish the floors, the way their skin caught the glow of torchlight, the subtle rhythm of breathing that accompanies untainted life. She catalogued it all silently, an archivist of flesh, energy, and movement. And in that observation, a dangerous thought began to crystallize. Youth could be taken, or at least harnessed if approached correctly, methodically, and without hesitation. Her own reflection, once the central measure of fear, now mirrored calculation. Each line, each slight pallor, each shadow of age in her features screamed a warning. Time was winning. And if the vitality she craved could be found elsewhere in those unblemished forms, then inaction was no longer an option. Desire and fear merged into something both compelling and precise. She would act, but this was no rash ambition. Elizabeth's approach was methodical. She studied the girls, learning their routines, understanding their habits, noting weaknesses, fears, and attachments. Observation alone was not enough. She needed context, control, and timing. Her mind, sharpened by years of study and isolation, converted curiosity into strategy. The human body, she realized, could be understood, influenced, and in some ways harvested, not through brute force, but through careful application of knowledge. Imagine the contrast, her own skin slowly betraying the secrets of time, set against the radiant, untested youth of the new arrivals. Each glance in the mirror, each reflection, reinforced the stakes. The more she observed, the more precise her imagination became. She pictured vitality as a commodity, portable, attainable, quantifiable. The idea was terrifying in its clarity, yet irresistible. There were small experiments at first, subtle manipulations, herbs, oils, baths, remedies. She tested the limits of influence, of effect. A blush here, a pallor there, a trick of light or shadow. Each success was catalogued, each failure analyzed. In her mind, she was already mapping outcomes, measuring the energy of youth against the inevitability of her own decay. Her isolation had done more than sharpen intellect. It had taught her patience. Patience to wait for opportunity, patience to refine methods, patience to plan with precision. She did not rush. The desire was steady, insistent, quiet in the corridors like the hum of stone, and in that quiet it festered. It became a pulse, a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, a constant whisper. The body, the vitality, the youth is within reach if only you have the courage to seize it. Even in this stage, it was not about cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was about survival, preservation, the obsession with maintaining what the world might otherwise strip away. Each young girl was a symbol, a warning, a resource. And Elizabeth, ever observant, knew that the more she understood them, the more control she could assert, not only over their presence, but over the relentless march of time itself. In those quiet moments, she imagined herself reflected in their untainted features, as if she could borrow from their vitality the way one might borrow light from a candle. It was a fantasy grounded in fear, intelligence, and isolation, and it grew louder with each day that passed. The castle walls no longer merely contained her, they enabled her. They amplified the obsession, provided secrecy, and concealed the transformation of thought into intent. The shift was subtle but inexorable. Observation became study, study became action, and action became desire. She was no longer merely preserving herself. She was seeking to acquire what she could not create. The line between fascination and compulsion blurred until it no longer existed. The fear of aging, the dread of power slipping away, had found a tangible outlet. And so, in the silent corridors lit by torches and moonlight, Elizabeth Báthory began to see youth not as innocence but as a resource, a vital, potent force, something that could be measured, captured, and in her mind made hers. The obsession that had begun with mirrors and shadows, with reflection and knowledge, now reached outward, toward the living embodiments of everything she feared losing. Time had a new adversary in her mind, and for the first time it was no longer enough to wait for it to slow. It would be challenged. Legends do not begin with truth. They begin with fear, with obsession, with stories whispered just loud enough to catch the imagination of those who listen. In Elizabeth's case, the legend of the blood baths did not spring fully formed from cruelty alone. It was born from a mind obsessed with youth, from mirrors that could not lie, from isolation that magnified desire, and from the human need to explain what terrifies us most, the refusal of time to bend. Imagine the first whispers, soft and hesitant, threading through the corridors of the castle. Servants spoke in hushed tones, carrying tales that were part observation, part speculation. Someone had seen the mistress in her private chambers, a ritual of oils and ointments, baths and compresses. Another claimed they glimpsed a girl leaving the room pale and silent, a shimmer of blood at her fingertips. Each whisper carried a hint of the impossible, the uncanny, each one distorted, exaggerated, feeding the imagination more than the fact. Blood became a symbol long before it became a story of horror. It represented vitality, life itself, the essence that the mind notices and fears will inevitably slip away. To the outside world it was terrifying. To Elizabeth, it was curiosity translated into metaphor. The body, the essence, the glow of youth, these were the treasures she sought, and when imagination touched obsession, reality became flexible. Small acts became exaggerated, innocent mistakes became evidence of intent, knowledge became myth, fear became legend. The castle itself helped the tale flourish. Its echoing halls carried stories faster than truth could catch them. One servant tells of a crimson-stained handkerchief, another of a locked chamber where shadows moved oddly. Nobody knew exactly what occurred, but each retelling added detail, precision, and drama. Humans are pattern seekers, and in the gaps the mind filled in the impossible. A minor tincture of blood becomes a river, a solitary act becomes a ritual, a whisper becomes a scream. But there is subtlety here. The legend served a purpose. It amplified fear, both within the castle and beyond its walls. It elevated Elizabeth to a figure beyond human comprehension, untouchable, enigmatic, powerful. Those in her proximity obeyed not merely because of status, but because myth demanded obedience. When the mind believes in something larger than life, reality bends to that belief. And so the story of the Blood Countess grew, even if the acts themselves were smaller, quieter, or different than legend would suggest. It is in this intersection of observation and imagination that Elizabeth's fame, or infamy, was forged. Blood was never merely a substance, it was a metaphor for what she feared losing: vitality, beauty, influence. The legend gave her a terrifying immortality in the minds of others, even as it was fueled by their fear, speculation, and awe. And legends have a way of shaping reality. The more people believe, the more impossible it becomes to separate fact from fiction. Consider the psychology of myth. It simplifies complexity, amplifies extremes, and satisfies an almost primal curiosity about power, morality, and mortality. In Elizabeth's story, each retelling served a human need: to understand, to warn, to justify. What the world could not tolerate, obsession, fear, intelligence turned toward self-preservation, was rendered monstrous and digestible. The blood baths were not merely acts, they were symbols, and symbols are more enduring than facts. Even in her mind, Elizabeth must have recognized the power of story. Mirrors showed aging, yes, but rumor showed fear. Isolation amplified perception, but legend amplified influence. Perhaps the whispers entertained her, or perhaps they disturbed her. Either way, they gave form to what was otherwise formless. The anxiety of decay made tangible, the obsession made visible, the fear made unforgettable. And so the legend spread. Travelers, emissaries, neighbors, scribes, each retelling layered on nuance, exaggeration, and drama. The woman who feared the passage of time became the Blood Countess, a figure larger than life, her image etched in collective imagination. The truth, smaller, quieter, and more human, was swallowed whole by the narrative her obsession had birthed. Blood in this story is both literal and symbolic. It is vitality, obsession, and mortality compressed into a single image. The legend endures because it speaks to a universal fear, that beauty, youth, and power are fleeting, and that humans will go to extremes to hold them. It terrifies, fascinates, and resonates because it is more than a story. It is a mirror. By the time historians and storytellers arrived centuries later, the line between act and allegory had blurred completely. The Blood Countess was no longer a woman, but a symbol of obsession, control, and the fear of inevitable decay. And like all symbols, she is easier to remember than the subtle reality, easier to fear than to analyze. The legend, in other words, had taken on a life of its own, fueled by whispers, imagination, and human need. And yet, beneath the myth, the quiet truth of obsession remained. A brilliant, fearful, isolated mind grappling with time, youth, and the impermanence of flesh. That is the story the whispers could not erase. That is the story that drives the obsession forward, even now, in the quiet corners of our minds. The Blood Countess is not merely a tale of horror. She is a mirror of desire, fear, and obsession, and the legend will endure because at its core it is a truth we all recognize. We fear what fades, we want what slips away, and sometimes we imagine we can hold it forever. The truth in Elizabeth's story is a fragile thing. It lives in shadows, in silences, in the careful bending of memory. Those who witnessed her life rarely spoke plainly. Some whispered in corners, some carried stories home in hushed tones, and some learned that survival demanded silence above all else. Every testimony was a reflection filtered through fear, loyalty, and self-preservation, and in that filtering, reality shifted, like sunlight refracted through crystal. Imagine the castle at night. Torches flicker along stone walls, shadows twist, and a servant moves quietly, careful not to disturb the mistress. She has seen much, yet she speaks cautiously. One misstep, one careless word could bring attention she cannot afford. Observation becomes a study in restraint. Every glance, every gesture, every murmur is calculated. Survival is not about confrontation, it is about perception. And perception in this world is malleable. Whispers are the lifeblood of such a place. They carry fragments, a door left ajar, a pale girl trembling, a bath steaming in candlelight. Each fragment is interpreted, exaggerated, retold. But exaggeration is not always malice, it is instinct. Fear distorts, memory bends. People protect themselves not by denying truth, but by shaping it. And in shaping it, they create legend. The Blood Countess, as history would remember her, was both more and less than the sum of what witnesses reported. Consider the servant who describes a room bathed in candlelight, the mistress moving with meticulous care, studying the reflection of youth and vitality. Did she see cruelty or did she see obsession? Did she interpret rituals as violence or as meticulous care misread through fear? The answer is unknowable. But in that unknowability, survival finds a rhythm. Speak little, speak cautiously, speak only in ways that preserve life. The stories become cryptic, layered, haunting in their ambiguity. Even those in power outside the castle found themselves subject to distortion. Letters arrived, reports written by intermediaries, filtered through layers of interpretation. Each observer added nuance, whether from judgment, fear, or fascination. A simple act, a bath, a treatment, a ritual could become a story of horror, and horror travels faster than clarity. The world outside the castle consumed these tales, each more vivid than the last, and the legend grew, unrestrained by fact. Inside, survival demanded emotional armor. Elizabeth had learned early that fear could be weaponized, and that silence could be a shield. She understood that witnesses would see what they feared to see, would remember what mattered most to their own safety. Pain, obsession, youth, they became prisms through which truth was refracted, and the castle absorbed it all, walls heavy with stories no one could fully untangle. The subtle interplay of observation and distortion was part of the rhythm of life there. A girl trembles as she passes a door, a whisper carries a rumor to the far hall, a shadow stretches along the stone. The world is alive with potential evidence, yet every piece is interpreted, analyzed, or silenced. To survive is to navigate these layers with precision. To survive is to understand not just the mistress, but the malleability of perception itself. Memory, too, is pliable. Humans do not record perfectly. They recall with bias, with fear, with desire to survive or impress. Witnesses, when questioned, delivered stories shaped by context, by expectation, by imagination. Some spoke of cruelty, some of obsession, some of cold curiosity. Each perspective contained fragments of truth, each fragment incomplete, each interpretation shaped by necessity. The result is a tapestry, intricate and unsettling, threaded with uncertainty. It is here that legend and survival intersect. To speak too plainly is dangerous. To remain silent is protective, but creates its own mythology. And so stories are carefully layered. Whispers become rumors, rumors become testimony, testimony becomes evidence. And through it all, Elizabeth's image grows larger, more terrifying, more incomprehensible. In the quiet of the castle she watched, she studied, she understood. She knew that what others saw was not the whole story, that fear would distort perception, and that survival required a careful calibration of action and restraint. Her obsession, her desire to control youth, to master time, was mirrored in the calculated way she manipulated perception, consciously or unconsciously. The human mind in this environment bends and shapes itself to conditions. Witnesses adapted, observers conformed, memory adjusted, and legend solidified. By the time history records these accounts, the lines between fear, observation, and reality blur entirely. Those who survived told only what allowed them to survive, whether consciously or not, and the echoes of their whispers, fragmented, distorted, amplified, became the foundation upon which myth would be built. Elizabeth, isolated yet always watching, understood this deeply. Power, she knew, was as much about perception as action. The stories, the whispers, the testimonies, they were instruments in the orchestra of control. And within their distortion, within the space between witness and truth, her obsession endured, more enduring than the fleeting youth she sought to preserve. The castle was alive with stories, each a reflection, a distortion, a survival tactic. And in the quiet corridors, under the weight of stone and shadow, the legend grew, fed by the very minds it terrified. The Blood Countess was not simply a woman who acted. She was the sum of perception, obsession, and survival, and in that sum the world saw something monstrous, unforgettable, and eternal. History is written not by those who act, but by those who survive, those who rule, those who decide what others may remember. Elizabeth Báthory's fate was shaped not only by her own obsession, but by the intricate web of politics, privilege, and power that stretched far beyond the stone walls of her castle. And within that web her voice, her explanation, her perspective, her defense, was never permitted. Imagine the council chambers, the candlelight flickering over high-backed chairs, quills scratching across parchment. Men of influence debated quietly, their words measured, their intentions layered with caution. They were not concerned with morality alone, nor even with justice. They were concerned with consequence, reputation, and the preservation of order. The deeds of the Blood Countess, real or imagined, were dangerous, not only for those directly affected, but for the fragile stability of power itself. Elizabeth's absence from these conversations was complete. Her name appeared in reports, in witness statements, in rumors circulating the noble courts, but she did not speak. Her silence was enforced by authority, by circumstance, by the very structure that surrounded her, and in that silence others filled the gaps. Whispers became proclamations, testimonies became edicts, legends became fact. The narrative was no longer hers to shape. It is striking how perception solidifies into reality when the one at the center cannot defend it. When observers write, when officials adjudicate, when neighbors speculate, the story takes on a life of its own. Facts fragment, exaggerations flourish, and imagination reconstructs the unknown. Elizabeth, isolated in her castle, watched as control slipped not from her hands but from her story. The legend grew, unstoppable, unshaped by her reasoning or evidence. The political context was equally decisive. Land was at stake, alliances hung in balance, debts demanded resolution. To the nobles who convened far from her chambers, the question was not solely, what did she do? But, what advantage can be gained? Power, after all, is selective. It amplifies what serves it and silences what threatens it. In this selective amplification, the Blood Countess was constructed, dangerous, monstrous, incomprehensible, perfect for politics, convenient for rivals, fearful for all who heard her name. Consider the private meetings behind heavy doors, where influence and negotiation mattered more than evidence. Here a story could be adjusted, details softened or sharpened, guilt amplified or minimized, all according to strategy. Those who controlled access to information controlled perception, and perception more than fact determines legacy. Elizabeth had become subject not merely to justice, but to storytelling as power. Her own intelligence, so long a tool for observation, was irrelevant here. Knowledge could preserve youth, manipulate the body, control the mind, but it could not rewrite the decisions made quietly in council rooms, far from candlelit corridors and stone walls. Her fate, her reputation, even her humanity was interpreted and judged without her participation. History, as always, belonged to the powerful. Isolation had honed her mind for precision, but power had its own calculations. Every letter she sent, every plea she might have made, was filtered, ignored, or dismissed. The laws of nobility were less about morality than order, less about truth than expediency. And in those chambers the story was decided. Elizabeth would not narrate her own life. Others would narrate it for her. The silence imposed upon her was deafening. In her cell, in her chambers, she may have replayed events endlessly, reconstructing her reality, questioning motives, imagining outcomes. But outside, the narrative had already hardened. Legends are seldom gentle, they are convenient, dramatic, and morally digestible. And the Blood Countess, as crafted by power, fit every requirement. Yet there is subtle irony here. In controlling her story, power amplified her legend. By silencing her, by shaping narrative for expediency, the world transformed obsession into myth. The political and social machinery, in its effort to regulate and contain, ensured her story would endure far longer than most. The truth became irrelevant, perception became eternal. We are left with a haunting observation. Control is often an illusion, even for those most meticulous. Elizabeth could manipulate bodies, she could study minds, she could command her immediate environment. But when the levers of broader power moved quietly, invisibly, her fate and her story were no longer hers. And in that absence of control, legend found room to grow, shadows found space to lengthen, and the whispers of the castle became the echoes of eternity. Power decides not only consequences but memory. It decides what will be remembered, what will be feared, and what will become untouchable myth. Elizabeth Báthory's reality, her intelligence, her fear, her obsession, was compressed, magnified, and immortalized through the hands of others. And in the quiet chambers of history, one lesson emerges. The story belongs not to the one who lives it, but to the one who shapes how it is told. Fear has a way of simplifying the world. It distills complexity into a single image, a single name, a single story that can be understood, repeated, and leveraged. In Elizabeth Báthory's case, that simplification was both her curse and a tool for others. The woman obsessed with youth, mirrors, and vitality became, in the minds of nobles and neighbours, a monster. And monsters, as history shows, are always useful. Imagine the sprawling lands of her family, estates stretching across hills and forests, villages under her distant gaze. Control was never absolute. Debts, alliances, and rivalries complicated every decision. But fear is a convenient stabilizer. When people believe in a monster, they obey, they comply, and they hesitate. Power consolidates itself not just through authority, but through terror. The legend of the Blood Countess was more than a story, it was a mechanism. Nobles who coveted lands and influence found that the monster served them well. Her absence from court, her isolation, and her growing obsession left a vacuum that rumour could fill. In that vacuum, her perceived monstrosity justified actions, facilitated negotiations, and allowed distant players to gain advantage without visible confrontation. The legend transformed her into both scapegoat and instrument. She was too dangerous to challenge directly, too infamous to ignore, yet too absent to defend herself. And the world accepted it because fear requires belief. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, servants bowed carefully, neighbouring lords nodded when her name surfaced. Each whisper reinforced the narrative, each exaggerated detail cemented obedience. Elizabeth's real actions, her fears, her obsessions, her intelligence, were irrelevant. The story itself became a tool, a lever of influence far beyond the reach of mirrors or youth or intellect. It is striking how fear can serve political ends. The legend was a shield for some, a weapon for others. Lands were secured, debts redirected, inheritances protected or seized. The world beyond the castle could act with greater freedom when the Blood Countess was perceived as monstrous, her humanity compressed into myth. And yet beneath the spectacle, the truth remained. She was a human mind, brilliant and flawed, navigating isolation, desire, and obsession. Even those who suffered under her authority, real or imagined, were shaped by the story as much as the deeds. Whispers of cruelty carried lessons, warnings, and reinforcement of social order. The fear of the monster replaced the subtle complexities of governance. In her absence, the myth instructed more effectively than law or decree ever could. It simplified morality into clear dichotomies: obedience or punishment, fear or survival, innocence or danger. Elizabeth's legend also endured because humans are drawn to extremes. Stories of obsession, blood, and immortality capture imagination more vividly than accounts of nuance and restraint. Complexity requires reflection, myth requires only attention, and so the world shaped her as much as she shaped her own obsession. The Blood Countess was convenient, terrifying, and endlessly memorable. Yet the irony is inescapable. The monster that others wielded for advantage was built from her obsessions, her intelligence, and her fear of decay. The tools she honed in isolation, study, observation, curiosity, were transformed into instruments for a narrative she could not control. Power simplified, amplified, and mythologized her. She became legend not because she needed to, but because the world outside her walls made her so. In this way, monsters are useful. They concentrate fear, legitimize action, and justify the improbable. They are symbols of everything a society cannot comprehend, manage, or control. And in their usefulness, they often outlast those who created them. Elizabeth's story demonstrates this paradox vividly. Obsession fuels action, isolation sharpens desire, and power, when wielded by others, ensures that legend eclipses reality. For those alive in her time, the Blood Countess served as a cautionary figure. For those who recorded her story, she became a tool for political maneuvering. And for posterity, she embodies the unsettling truth that fear can be harnessed, manipulated, and weaponized, long after the original mind has vanished from sight. And yet the human impulses that created her legend, fear of aging, desire for control, obsession with vitality, remain timeless. They resonate because they are universal. The monster was useful in her era, and the legend remains useful to us today, as a mirror of the extremes that fear and obsession can create. Through the lens of history, we see a woman transformed by circumstance, intelligence, and isolation into a symbol larger than life. But beneath the myth, the caution is quiet, intimate, and unavoidable. When obsession is untempered, when fear is weaponized, when power decides the story, monsters emerge, not fully created by the world, nor fully by their own hands, but somewhere in the tension between the two. And in that tension, Elizabeth Báthory remains immortal. Her body decayed, her life ended, yet her story, magnified, distorted, weaponized, continues to haunt the imagination. Fear and legend, once unleashed, rarely surrender their power. Time, relentless and indifferent, eventually reaches everyone. For Elizabeth Báthory, it arrived not in grand gestures, not in public spectacle, but in the slow, inescapable solitude of her imprisonment. The walls that had once contained her curiosity, her obsession, and her intelligence now became silent witnesses to the very thing she had feared most: decay without reflection, age without influence, mortality without escape. Imagine her alone in a dim chamber, the stone cold beneath her fingertips, shadows stretching long and unbroken across the floor. Candles flicker in the corners, but they do not warm the air. The castle, once a theatre for observation and control, has become a mirrorless cage. No mirrors, no witnesses, no instruments of power, just time and the slow unravelling of flesh and mind. Aging, which she had once attempted to resist, now comes unopposed. Each line on her face, each tremor in her hands, each loss of vitality, is a quiet affirmation of mortality. She had sought to capture youth, to preserve beauty, to command perception, and yet here it arrives anyway, immutable, impartial. The very thing that obsession could not conquer now defines her existence. Isolation distorts perception further. Without anyone to observe, to serve, to witness, the mind drifts inward. Memories become conversations, regrets become companions, and obsession turns inward upon itself. Elizabeth measures herself not against others, not against mirrors, but against a haunting ideal that recedes with every day, the impossible standard of permanence she once sought to achieve. Her mind, sharp and precise in the prime of her obsession, now wanders through shadows. She recalls the young girls, the baths, the careful observation, the methods and experiments, all filtered through time, distorted, abstracted. Were her acts deliberate or the product of fear magnified by solitude? Memory bends when it is all one has, and in that bending, obsession mutates into something both intimate and terrifying. Silence is profound in this context. It magnifies every heartbeat, every breath, every creak of stone. It exposes the fragility of the body and the futility of knowledge. There is no audience, no witnesses, no court of opinion, only the slow, undeniable tick of existence. The castle's walls, once a stage for power, now echo her solitude, a reminder that time respects no obsession, no intellect, no legend. Even the mind, her most potent instrument, cannot fully resist the inevitability of decay. Intelligence, which once allowed her to predict, manipulate, and control, now serves only as a witness to loss. She counts lines, measures strength, catalogues weakness, not to preserve but to understand the unstoppable. And in understanding there is a quiet horror. The brilliance of youth and power cannot outlast the passage of time. Yet there is a dark poetry here. The obsessions that defined her life, mirrors, knowledge, youth, control, now confront her without interference. She cannot manipulate perception, cannot impose legend, cannot bend anyone's belief. She is left with the raw, intimate truth. The human body ages, the mind remembers, and isolation amplifies the experience. The irony is complete. She feared the natural process of decline, yet it has arrived fully, without resistance, without distraction. Imagine the quiet of night, when candles gutter low and shadows collapse into the corners of the chamber. Elizabeth listens to the subtle rhythm of her own life, a pulse that is faint, irregular, undeniable. Every creak of the stone floor, every whisper of wind against the castle, is a reminder of continuity and impermanence. The world outside moves on, indifferent to legend or myth, indifferent to her presence. And inside she confronts herself, no mirrors, no witnesses, no escape. Her obsession, which once shaped reality, now exists only as memory and echo. The mind, which once mastered knowledge, now contends with inevitability. The body, which once demanded preservation, now yields to decay. And in that surrender there is a haunting lesson. The very thing she sought to control, the thing she feared, cannot be denied forever. And yet, even in this final solitude, the story persists. The Blood Countess lives beyond these walls, in whispers, in legends, in fear. Her body decays, but her myth endures. And perhaps that is the cruelest irony of all. Her obsession with permanence did not grant eternal youth, but it did grant eternal memory. In the darkness, alone, Elizabeth Báthory confronts the ultimate truth of obsession. Time cannot be cheated, power cannot preserve flesh, and legends once unleashed outlast the bodies that created them. The candle flickers one last time in the empty chamber, shadows folding over stone, and silence swallows the sound of a life that feared, studied, and sought to defy its own end. Legends endure because they speak to something eternal in us: fear, desire, obsession. Elizabeth Báthory's story survived not merely because of acts committed, whispers repeated, or blood-stained myths, but because it touches a truth we all recognize: the terror of time, the fragility of youth, and the desperate longing to preserve what inevitably slips away. Even now, centuries later, we feel it. When we glance in the mirror at midnight, trace a line that wasn't there before, or notice a strand of hair graying where it once gleamed, we recognize Elizabeth in ourselves. Not in her deeds, not in the legend, but in the pulse of anxiety, in the quiet dread that beauty, power, or vitality might fade. Her obsession was universal. Her extremity was merely a reflection, magnified, of a fear we all carry. Consider the power of story. Fact is fragile. Truth bends, memory distorts, but fear crystallizes. Legends are efficient. They take complexity, amplify it, and make it unforgettable. Elizabeth became immortal not because she bathed in blood, not because she ruled with cruelty, but because she embodied obsession itself. The world needed a vessel for its unease, and she became it. Her life, her isolation, her intelligence, and her terror of aging all converged into a symbol, one that could be carried far beyond her walls, far beyond her death. Why does she endure? Because we continue to see ourselves in her. Social media filters, cosmetic surgery, diet fads, anti-aging serums, they are echoes of the same desire: to resist time, to control perception, to extract vitality from the world around us. Elizabeth was a distorted mirror of that impulse, and mirrors, when cracked or exaggerated, are terrifying. The legend survives because the fear she lived is alive, constant, intimate. Even modern retellings, books, films, podcasts, feed the same need. We tell her story at night because it resonates with something primal. It's not about crime or punishment, it's about obsession. It's about fear made tangible, about the extremes a mind can reach when it refuses to accept the inevitable. Each retelling reawakens that pulse, the dread of decay, the hunger to hold what slips through our fingers, the recognition that obsession is often the cost of desire. The legend also survives because it is convenient. Symbols simplify. A woman who feared aging becomes a monster. A monster becomes morality condensed. A cautionary tale, a fear made digestible. The nuance of intellect, of loneliness, of isolation, all subtle, intimate, disappears beneath the weight of narrative. And yet beneath the myth the human truth remains. Obsession, fear, and desire are universal. The story survives because the impulses that created it never die. And there is another reason: we need monsters. Humans thrive on extremes, on cautionary tales, on figures larger than life. Elizabeth's obsession with youth and vitality, her descent into isolation and compulsion, satisfies that hunger. She is a mirror we cannot fully escape, a warning we cannot fully ignore. The fear she embodied is uncomfortable because it lives within each of us, quiet, intimate, relentless. In the end, the story is not about Elizabeth Báthory alone. It is about all of us who look into the mirror and wonder, what am I losing? What will fade? How far would I go to preserve it? She endured in myth because she captured something fundamental: the universality of obsession with self-preservation, the terror of time, and the lengths to which a human mind can go when left unchecked. And now, listen closely. Consider your own reflection. The line in the skin, the shadow under the eye, the quiet tremor of time pressing against you. We may not bathe in blood, we may not command servants, but obsession manifests differently, through fear of loss, through comparison, through quiet, relentless measurement. Elizabeth's story survives because it is a mirror. Look too long and you may see it in yourself. Perhaps that is why legends never die. They are eternal not because they are true, but because the impulses that created them are immortal. Youth fades, Power slips, desire persists, obsession endures. And so we remember her, not as a woman, not as a monster, but as an echo of a fear we all carry. The Blood Countess is immortal because she reflects something unending in every human mind. The unwillingness to yield to time, the quiet terror of impermanence, and the dangerous allure of trying to hold life, beauty, and vitality forever. And as you sit there, listening, perhaps at night, perhaps in the quiet hours when the world is still, ask yourself, if beauty is power and time is the enemy, how far would you go? Because the legend endures and so does the fear.